Our next keynote is an inspiration and a powerhouse. Karen Dillon, she was the editor for Harvard Business Review magazine, and she co-authored 3 books with Clayton Christensen, including a new one on how we can solve poverty with innovation. And so she truly is amazing. But she's here today to discuss the book, How Will You Measure Your Life? And to encourage us to look at what's our purpose and how might we leave the world a better place than we found it. So please join me in welcoming Karen Dillon.
How many of you have goals for your life? Things that you hope to accomplish, plans, maybe you've written them down? You know what they are, right? We're all working towards them. If you're in this room, I'm guessing you're a high achiever, and goals are very meaningful for you. Keeps you going. I know I had goals for my own life, but this is the story of how I realized that I was coming perilously close to not only going off track, but making irreparable harm to my life because of my goals. This is the story of what happened to me one day when I was just an editor on a deadline. So I was the editor of Harvard Business Review magazine, a job I considered to be the pinnacle of my career. And we were trying to fill a double issue. We needed an extra article to put in our July-August issue, and I was looking for something good, but not super hard. So casting around, I heard that a professor at Harvard Business School, Clayton Christensen, had been asked to address the graduating class of business school, and the students had been profoundly moved by what he said. Now, at the time, I didn't know Clay very well. I certainly knew his reputation. He's one of the most influential and respected thought leaders in the world. His book, The Innovator's Dilemma, was the only business book that Steve Jobs kept on his bookshelf. Clay was the one who started the theory of disruptive innovation. You may know that. So that was enough to convince me Clay must have said something good. Let's see if I can get over to his office, bring a little digital recorder, record it, and turn it into some kind of an essay for our magazine. My deadline would be made, my space would be filled, job done. I called Clay's office. Again, I didn't know him, asked if I could come over, and somewhat miraculously, he said sure, which I now know was crazy because he literally is the busiest man I know, and it's very hard to get into his office. I drove over thinking of the deadline, the traffic, the things that were still on my to-do list at my desk. My mind was occupied. Pulled into the Harvard Business School parking lot, raced into his office, put my little recorder down in front of him, and said, pearls of wisdom, what'd you say? An hour and a half later, I left his office, stood in the parking lot, could not get my keys in the car, just stood there thinking about what we had just talked about. As I drove back to my office, I thought of nothing about deadlines or to-do lists or what we were having for dinner tonight. I was thinking about my own life. In the next year, I systematically and carefully, with the support of my husband and my family, dismantled my entire life. I quit my job as the editor of Harvard Business Review with goodwill all around. My husband and I sold our reasonably tony 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Boston. We gave away virtually all of our furniture to a charity that provides furniture for people coming out of homelessness. We decided what we cared enough to ship and otherwise take in suitcases. We moved with our 2 daughters to my husband's native London into a very small flat. We gave away our cars. We had no car. We completely did a do-over on our life. Now you might be asking, what did Clay say to me in that office that caused me to do that? Well, he's the great Clay Christensen, the font of wisdom that Steve Jobs kept on his bookshelf. It must have been really profound, right? Or really important business thinking, or something that somehow would resonate so much that I would do all that. This is what we talked about. The 3 questions he thinks are the single most important questions to ask his students at the end of every semester. Now, these must be really great questions, right? He's been teaching at business school. It's the end, the culmination of the semester. The great Clay Christensen, what does he ask? How do I find happiness in my career? How do I find happiness in my personal life? And this is for Harvard Business School graduates. How do I stay out of jail? How did these 3 questions cause me to do all of what I did? Clay himself had been a graduate of Harvard Business School class of 1979. And if any of you are alumni of Harvard Business School, you'll know they really roll out the red carpet for their reunions every 5 years, for example. It's a very big deal. And you come back and you network and you sort of chest thump about how important you are and how your career is going and how life is so fabulous. He started to notice at the 5-year and then the 10-year and then the 15-year reunion, people were not as happy as he thought they would be. How was it that all these people he liked and respected, people they had had late-night conversations about how they were going to change the world and do great things, started little by little to talk about how didn't really love their job, well paid, didn't make me happy. Stop talking about the job altogether. Nothing great to say about it. Divorced, estranged from their children, estranged from their parents, their family. What happened to these people who had everything going for them to sort of end up with the life that they just didn't want to talk about and were unhappy with as their successive reunions occurred? So he spent a lot of time thinking about it, and what he ends up saying to all of his students is, I've taught you the best business theories I know to make good decisions for your company in the future, but make sure you make good decisions for your life. All of his classmates who were finding themselves unhappy, increasingly unhappy with their life, had actually executed a strategy to have exactly that life. They may have thought they were headed on one path, like I did, but little by little, what they were doing was marching very deliberately towards a path that was not going to make them happy. So as we worked through the questions in his office that day, I couldn't help but apply them to my own life. And I found them really powerful, really sobering, and ultimately enough to make me want to do the dramatic do-over to rebuild my life in a different way. I'm going to share how Clay and I talked about those 3 questions so you can think about them for your own life as well. How do I find happiness in my career? Pick great jobs, right? Always want to pick the great job. Well, here's the problem with that. People who are high achievers in particular, again, I'm going to conclude you all are here in this room, are naturally drawn to the things that give them the fastest return on their investment. Right? We get rewards at work. You get a raise, you close a sale, you do something exciting. You see immediately the benefits of the work that you've chosen to do. But in reality, we tend to choose jobs that actually only provide us with short-term feelings of satisfaction or happiness because of that desire to see the rewards right away, not what is actually going to motivate us. Now, the best-selling article or the best-read article in Harvard Business Review for years, I want to say even decades, was about motivation, what really motivates us in our work. And it was by a psychologist called Daniel Hertzberg. And he had a really interesting theory about how to think about and pick a job that's going to make you jump out of bed every morning, as opposed to one where little by little those rewards will seem to not be as exciting anymore. His idea was that satisfaction in a job is not measured on one continuous scale of dissatisfied to satisfied, right? If you're satisfied, that's great, you have a great job. But there are 2 separate scales. One he calls hygiene factors, things that you might put on your resume, the job title, your salary, is your office good? Did you get a bigger office? Did you get a good parking space? Is it a cool company to work for? Are they impressed when you tell them at a cocktail party? Those are things that seem like the right reasons to pick jobs, but they are hygiene factors on one scale. And the hygiene scale goes from I'm not unhappy to I'm unhappy. But I'm not unhappy is not the same thing as I'm really deeply satisfied and happy. You can hope to, and you should, get to the point where your job doesn't actively make you unhappy. You need some of those things, but that's not going to make you jump out of bed in the morning. So what does? What we call intrinsic factors. These are less tangible. You have to think about them. You may not consider them when you're thinking about your next job. You may not consider them when you're working with your colleagues. But these we know over time are the reasons that people grow to love their jobs. Am I respected by my colleagues? Do I believe in the mission of this company? Do I have chances to grow? Do I believe that I can become better at what I do here? Does my boss give me those opportunities? They're intrinsic, they're not visible, you might not put them on your resume, but those are the things that are going to help you to want to jump out of bed every morning and go to your job. And you have to make your choices, making sure you're not dissatisfied, but the happiness scale relies on those intrinsic motivators. Do you have them in your work? Do you think about them when you make job choices? Do you give them to the people who work for you and around you? All of these things are possible if you think about it for a minute, but if you don't even put it into your equation, you're going to find yourself making increasingly hygienic choices, choices that are just for the optics, but don't make you happy every day. How do I stay happy in my job? Make sure you have intrinsic motivators. How do I stay happy in my personal life? This was the big one that caused me to stand at my car for such a long time. It is the concept of how strategy is formed by businesses. Now, strategy, you might think, are the goals or the aspirations, the mission of a company, right? Whatever they say the goal is this year, that's our strategy. Well, in reality, we know that strategy is not what companies say it is. Strategy is formed by the everyday choices that employees in that company make with their company resources, their time, their energy. Strategy is formed in hundreds of individual decisions by the people who work in a company. Let me give you an example. If a company says that long-term growth is its strategy, it's its highest priority, but everybody who's in the high potential program is rewarded for short-term results before they rotate out of the high potential program, what do you think they're going to focus on? If a company says that its new, inexpensive model of a new product is what they focus on selling this year, they want to reach certain sales goals on that new product, but the best salespeople know they make more commission on the old one that sells for a higher price, what strategy is that company demonstrating? Strategy is formed not from the top and sent down. It's what all of us do and choose to do about making decisions about what matters most every single day. Same thing is true in our lives. I recognized in myself that I would have told you my strategy was to be a great mother and wife and daughter and sister, that my personal life was the most important thing to me. But if you looked at my calendar, a day, a week, a month, a year, blocked off what was required, we have to work, we have jobs, but looked at all the discretionary choices I made, marked them in yellow, there would be an awful lot of yellow on that page, and those yellow marks would not map to my strategy. It's really easy to do this as high achievers, right? You stay at the office a little bit later, finish something, it feels good. It's way harder to see the payoff of raising good kids on a daily basis. Some days it's hard to imagine you'll ever get there. But one thing I became very clear on is that my strategy was being formed by the everyday choices that I was making, and the personal relationships in my life were way more important than my strategy's execution suggested they were. Now, why is this a big deal? You know, can't you sort of sequence your life? Your family loves you, they'll understand, they'll wait. Your friends love you, they'll understand, they'll wait. Well, there's a lot of research that tells us that personal relationships, warm, meaningful personal relationships, are the greatest cause of long-term happiness for all of us. There's something called the Grant study at Harvard, which studied the Harvard class of 1938, all men, unfortunately, because at that time there was all men, longitudinally through their entire life. And the single biggest determinant across this group of happiness was not money, fame, or career. It was warm personal relationships. But more than even just personal happiness, it was connected to physical health. Good health was in part a result of the self-care of tending to your relationships and having good ones that lasted throughout your life. Research from BYU tells us that men in midlife with obesity face the exact same physical symptoms as men in midlife who are lonely. Obesity and loneliness have the same effect on us. And for those of you who are younger than the age brackets I'm talking about, let me point out this is not just an end-of-life, looking back regret problem. This is something that affects us at all ages and stages of our life. Research from UC San Diego recently told us that we have peak loneliness at 3 different phases of our life. In our 80s, perhaps not surprisingly, in our late 50s, and in our late 20s. Tending to your personal relationships because it's part of your strategy is too important to get wrong. And that's what I recognized as I sought to rebuild my life. We didn't stay in London forever. We moved back after 2 years, but we kind of reconnected as a family, and I chose to work a little bit differently than I had been working before. I made sure that my resource allocation of my personal time and energy matched my strategy. How do I stay out of jail? Now, when Clay first started giving this talk, it was a little bit close to home because he was classmates with the CEO of Enron, Jeffrey Skilling. And he had other classmates who had had sort of not great endings to their story. So it's a good question to ask. Jeffrey Skilling was a good guy, according to Clay, in business school. How did he end up in jail? Well, that's the strategy he executed with his life. He literally set about, step by step, on a path that would wind him in jail. Now, you may say, not me, I would never do this. In fact, let's just take a quick poll. Raise your hand if you have no integrity. Raise it up high, real quickly. Right, we all think we have integrity, and we all think that should we be faced with those choices where, it's a moral choice that's bad choice, good choice, it's going to come in a kind of neon sign, and of course I'm going to take the good choice. I would never do that. But what happens in life is what happens in business. It's called marginal thinking. None of us think we're going to go down that path to go to jail. We would never do that. He would never do that. But you make decisions based on what you see as the marginal cost of that choice. I can guarantee you Jeffrey Skilling's first cheating was not the entire strategy of Enron. I can guarantee you that the parents who are now showing up in federal court in Boston for having done something for their children, that was not the first time that they cut a corner, hid something from their children, sacrificed some line for themselves so that they could advance their children. In marginal thinking, we start saying to ourselves, just this once, I'll do this. What's the big deal? Just this once. Just this once, I'll cheat on my expense account. Just this once, I'll sign off on my boss's expense account because he'll put the big expense on his account, and I know we can do that. We can get away with that. Just this once, I'll lie about X, Y, Z. You decide what it is. None of the people we've seen in the news in the past few years who have really fallen from grace ever thought that they would end up where they are. I just know it's not possible. Lance Armstrong, great bicyclist, never thought that he would end up losing everything he'd ever worked for because of his blood doping scandal. But that started with a just this once, I'll add oxygen, or whatever he did in the early stages. Harvey Weinstein. Maybe some of these guys are bad guys to the core, but I believe they fall into the trap of marginal thinking. Just this once. And here's what happens with just this once thinking. You have this line that you sort of decide that's the bad line, and I'm going to not be way over there, but I'll just this once do that thing. Now, I've already moved away from my moral line right here, but I'm not very far. No big deal. I just cheated one time. Just this once the next time, because there's always an extenuating circumstance, right? Just this once. Gotta watch. Just this once. Boom. It's really easy to compromise your values when each individual step is not a big one, but they're really far from where you started. Just this once is marginal thinking, and it will lead you down a destructive path to a strategy for your life that you don't want. So how do you avoid that? Decide what you stand for. What is your moral line? What do you agree to do or not do? And stand for it all the time. It's easier, it's easier to stay true to your values 100% of the time than 98% of the time. Because what's that 2%? When is it okay to compromise? When is it okay to cheat? When is it okay to turn a blind eye? If you decide what you stand for and you stand for it all the time, you're going to find yourself staying on a much better path for your own life than the one that can lead you really far astray. So, sum up where I was in my life. That was 8 years ago. I quit. We gave up all our worldly possessions. We moved to a small flat in London, learned that you can't stay mad at your family or ignore each other or tune each other out in any way, shape, or form when you're only X feet away. It was quite an eye-opener for my children and a fantastic experience for all of us. But maybe I overcourse corrected a little. We had that experience, and then we sort of reconstructed our life and put it back and came back to Massachusetts, where my family's from, and came back as new people. And I continue to work. I just work in different ways. As Amy mentioned, I've written several books with Clay, which allowed me to work differently. I feel that the biggest gift I have given, the thing I'm most proud of over the past 8 years, is that I've been really present with my children and my husband. And you all know you can be physically present, but not really truly present. I look back and think of how many times my kids were telling me something important to them, and I was looking away, or I was looking down at my phone, or I wasn't zoning in at all. I I don't do that anymore. When I'm there, I'm there. You have me. And I feel like as a consequence, I really know my kids and I really know my family. And they also know what I stand for and what I value because I've made choices that I think have made that clear to them. I don't regret the do-over of my life, but I don't advise it. Be better than me. I like to say I'm the ghost of Christmas future. You don't need to get to this point before you decide, are you on track with the goals of your own life? It's really easy to bob along and never stop and think about it before you're really far off course. And if you take a few minutes to think about, what do you want to accomplish with your life? Does your work give you true happiness, full happiness, intrinsic happiness? Does your personal resource allocation match your goals? And do you stand for something you're proud of? If you can answer those questions yourself, maybe not in one sitting, maybe over time, it took me a year to get to my decision making, you'll be on track for a much better life, a much happier life. And you won't be like one of the classmates that Clay saw every 5 years who increasingly were dissatisfied. We measure everything in business, KPIs, increases in shares of market, return rates on marketing efforts, just tiny decimals. We know so many things about our work, but how about our lives? How will you measure your life? That was the question Clay asked me that day, and I took a long time to think about it and try to have an answer I liked. I didn't like my answer then, but I do like it now. And I hope you can come to an answer that makes you happy for that too. Thank you. All right, so now I'm going to try to save you a little heartache, my heartache, by asking you to go through the exercise a little bit as a starting point that I went through starting that day beside my car and then in the course of the years since then, applying those business theories to the things that are most important in your life. So it's just for you. There are no right or wrong answers. My version of a happy life is maybe totally different than someone else's version of a happy life. But let me walk you through and have you take a few minutes to figure out how are you doing on these questions. So if you have a piece of paper, you can do it. You can write it down. You can do it privately into your phone, whatever works for you. No one's going to see but you. But I think if you begin to shape and think about these, you'll begin to have answers, or at least answers you can refine and improve in the years ahead. All right, first question. Intrinsic or hygiene? List the intrinsic motivators right now in your current job. Put the hygiene factors on the other side and see how does that list balance out. Do you have enough? Now let me remind you, hygiene are things that probably you'd put on your resume. Fancy title, the impressive name of a company, better office, great vacation, all things that you get told by the HR department. Intrinsic are things that are less tangible, you have to think about, but that respect you, grow you, enrich you in the course of your work. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to work on that. Okay, let's pause for a second. This is a list you should continue to work on. And by the way, all hope is not lost if you don't like your list right now. Actually, anyone willing to raise their hand if you think your list is perfect already, or is there room for improvement? For most people, there's room for improvement. All hope is not lost. If you don't like your list, you can fix some of this. You can do some of these things. Intrinsic motivators can be sought in a job. You can ask for growth opportunities. You can present yourself as willing to and eager to learn. You can make sure you're working on, whenever possible, projects you actually care about. If you know that these things are going to make a difference in how you feel about your work, seek them out. And for those of you who are in a position of managing others, be very conscious of this. There's not a single job, no matter where it is in the organization, that you can't provide some more intrinsic motivation for people who work for you. Are you giving people a chance to grow? Are they treated with respect? Do they care about the work they're doing? Think about that, and that makes a giant difference in the way people will greet their job every day. You have a lot of power as a manager. Use it. Use it as a force for good. It's okay if your hygiene factors are great. That's fantastic. You won't be unhappy. But is it enough to settle for not being unhappy? Keep the list, work on it, and when you come to an intersection in your career where you're making choices, think about doing an analysis of what the next job will be based on intrinsic and hygiene factors and make sure the balance is good or there's enough. to make sure that both of those are high on the scale. Statistically, by the way, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, tells us that there is a salary above which people are no more happy than they are below. I can't remember the numbers now, 80,000. So salary matters, but it's at a certain point it doesn't. Happiness, it's the top of the hygiene factor, statistically. At least I believe this Nobel Prize winner has thought about this. So that's not enough. It's not just money. Money can get you here. Money can represent respect and stretch and challenge, but money itself is not going to be an intrinsic motivator. Okay, your personal resource allocation. This was my game changer, but think about a minute, maybe even open up your calendar and look at how you're spending your time. Give yourself a margin of error for the things you have no choice on. We go to work, we have certain obligations, but be honest with your own assessment. Look at a day, a week, a month, pick it, or think about it. How often are you making discretionary choices that don't align with what you say your goal is? Your strategy is not what you say it is. Your strategy is what choices you make every single day. So take a minute now, do some sort of analysis, whatever works for you, of how are your personal resources aligning with your goals for yourself, personal and professional. As you're working your way through this, ask yourself, do you have a strategy for your life? Have you articulated it? A lot of people kind of like to just bob along with whatever life throws at them, right? It's easier not to have to take responsibility for your own happiness. I don't recommend that. I recommend actively thinking over time about what you're trying to achieve with your life, what's going to matter to you. Because if you know what that answer is, you're going to make choices of allocating your personal resources against that. If you don't, unintentionally find yourself really bobbing off course. So take the time to think about it. There's probably no more important question. What is the strategy for your life? And then you have a kind of North Star for deciding when you have choices about how to spend your energy, your focus, your attention, your time. Where are you devoting it to? And then finally, this one's hard and easy at the same time. You don't have to write this down because maybe it's too hard, but decide what you stand for. Know it. Have it as a compass so that when those choices do come up that seem small, the little indiscretions, the gray areas, the things that don't make you feel comfortable but somehow you justify it as just this once. Decide what you stand for. It's easier to have that as a roadmap. I'm not going to be silent when I see X or Y or Z bad thing happen. I'm not going to cheat in any form at work. I'm going to tell the truth when asked. Whatever is important to you, if you know what you stand for, you can stand for it all the time. Write it down if you feel comfortable, but at least ask yourself the question. Because then I think you can measure yourself against all that in all the times where you think there might be extenuating circumstances to not stand for it this time. It's a map, it's a compass. It's how you don't go that far off course with the just this once. All of these are experiments or thoughts just for you. You don't have to share it with anyone, but I recommend that you take the time to continue to work on it and refine it and think about it. It will provide you with a much better roadmap for the years ahead, hopefully one that will lead you to a point of having a career you love, having personal relationships that are meaningful to you and that are there for you at all the stages of peak loneliness, 20s, 50s, and 80s. And hopefully it'll mean that you never even have to think about secretly raising your hand when asked who doesn't have integrity. Be the person you want to be. And you have to make a conscious choice to be that. I wish you good luck in thinking about how to measure your own life. Thank you very much.